Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for an artist talk with our special guest, Lehuauakea. And a special welcome to Lehua, who's had such a busy month of travel and projects, and to their partner Ian, who traveled here with them. We're so glad to have you both here. Thank you so much. My name is Danielle Knapp. I'm the Makash curator here at the JSMA. And so it's my honor to work with artists in the United States, and specifically in the Pacific Northwest region, and especially to do work like we've done in response to the Common Reading Assigned book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, over the last 2 years. University engagement with this book, reading the words of a citizen Potawatomi enrolled member who's a botanist, a mother, all of these different roles that Kimmerer recognizes in her own identity and her own existence, has been incredibly thought-provoking and eye-opening, and a wonderful call to action for those of us who come to this material from all different levels of familiarity or knowledge. For myself, as an uninvited guest on Kalapuyan land here at the University of Oregon, Kimmerer's call to action to think about my responsibility in that community that I'm a part of with all of you, all of our human and more than human neighbors, is really powerful. And so to work with a colleague, Zoe Cambor, who's since left for a PhD program, to curate our current Common Seeing show, Our Shared Breath, Creativity, and Community, was a really wonderful opportunity for Zoe and me to think about works in our collection, artists whose works we knew of, artists we didn't yet know. We needed to do research and to have our ears and eyes open to find those artists that we wanted to include, and to think about how that contributes to a larger way of thinking about the themes in Kimmerer's book. So our Common Seeing show has been extended through October, so coming into this next academic year, there's still a few more months to see Our Shared Breath. This project was supported by a grant from the American Association of Art Dealers Foundation. I think I might have gotten my letters out of order there, ADAA Foundation, and we're so grateful for them, for their support. And I'm just really appreciative of this opportunity, especially to work with and learn from Lehuauakea about what it means when we talk here in Oregon, specifically in Eugene, about being on Kalapuyan land, the history of a land that was stewarded and cared for and loved for thousands of years by its original inhabitants, their descendants, who are now primarily members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and then to think about what that means for the present moment and the future as well. So I really appreciate Lehua's work with this topic, and I think we'll have some time for questions at the end. So after Lehua presents, if you'd like to have some discussion, let's please do that. The gallery is open till 5 today, so if you haven't yet seen their work on view in the show, I encourage you to go up and look at the work after the talk. I think that's everything I wanted to say. So thank you so much for being here, Lehuauakea, and I will take a seat so we can hear from you.
Okay, is this, okay. I'm so short, I never know. Aloha mai kākou, my name is Lehuauakea. I am a Native Hawaiian artist and barkcloth maker. And just want to thank you all for being here. It's a lot more than I anticipated, so thank you for filling the room and sharing space. Today I wanted to just share about a little bit, the context of the work that I've made for this exhibition, kind of how it situates itself within the larger picture of my overall practice, but also the history of kapa making, how this practice is important to Native Hawaiian culture, traditionally and contemporary, and the role that my community has played in helping me arrive at this point in my work. So before I get into anything, all the fancy stuff later, I will share a little bit about my upbringing and kind of what launched me on this trajectory that I ultimately am finding myself in now. I was born actually in Portland, Oregon. My parents met at U of O. Ironically, this is my first time ever being here. So yeah, things really come full circle, don't they? So you could say I was conceived here. Thank you. I was born in Portland, but my parents moved me back to the Big Island of Hawaii, which is where I have a lot of ancestral history, many, many generations back. And this is where I was raised by my grandparents on the east side of the island, the wet side. And they wanted me to go to Kamehameha schools, which was a school founded for Native Hawaiian youth by the last princess of the Kamehameha line, Keli'i Bernice Pauahi Bishop, in 1887. And at this school, it really laid the grounds for a lot of my cultural values, my sense of community and sense of responsibility to that community, understanding who I am as a young Native Hawaiian and what my contributions to our people can look like, which can take many forms. And I think that's one thing that I really took away from my education there. So that's me when I was cuter. And I think it's important to also acknowledge that, within the scope of the work that I do now, whether it's traditional barkcloth making or painting, drawing, installation, no matter how far the work goes or the medium that it takes the form of, I wouldn't be able to do this kind of work without the support, guidance, and teaching from my elders. And so this right here is a picture of me with my Hanai Uncle Wes. So we're not related by blood. That's kind of what Hanai means, but our families are essentially that close in relationship. And so he, back in the 80s, studied with a lot of barkcloth makers and traditional practitioners in Samoa and Hawaii, and eventually Fiji and Tonga as well. And that was a time during what's called the Hawaiian Renaissance when a lot of our cultural practices in Hawaii were coming back into play. Our language was seeing a huge resurgence. The self-identity of our communities and individuals within those communities was reaching a sense of empowerment and pride in determining who we are for ourselves and carrying on that agency as Native Hawaiians today. And my Uncle Wes was part of that movement with regards to barkcloth making. So if you're familiar with the word tapa, you may have seen a lot of different kinds of that material. It's a traditional practice. It's a non-woven textile made from the bark of trees. And this was a textile used for clothing, for bedding, for ceremony. And it was something that we nearly lost in Hawaii, and it went dormant for many, many generations. And it's thanks to people like my Uncle Wes, my teacher, who helped to bring it back for our people and continue to teach individuals like myself and many others so that this practice and the mentality around it, the values around it, don't ever die out. They may take several different forms and evolve over time, as they should, but the root of that tradition is still very much alive. So just want to thank him. And this is actually the same individual that my grandmother used to babysit about 60 years ago. So I have to thank her too for carrying on that relationship, and he's always had a soft spot for her. So a large reason why he's able to teach me is because he has so much love for my grandma. And like I mentioned before, barkcloth is made from trees, so tree bark. It's a very sustainable practice. The most common tree that we would use for the making of this material is the paper mulberry tree. And this was a plant that was so important to my ancestors that it actually followed the migration out of Taiwan, what's known as the Austronesian migration, out of Taiwan into the Pacific and throughout many of the thousands of islands that still exist today. And so barkcloth followed my people, our ancestors, throughout the oceans because it was so important. And so throughout most of the Pacific, what was considered Pacific Islanders, we have varying traditions of barkcloth. Typically, it's very specific to each community. So the motifs, the dyes that are used are place specific, community specific, sometimes even as dialed in as family specific. Like our tattoo patterns are very specific to a certain lineage or individual or family line. But yeah, anyway, it's a very labor-intensive process that involves not only 18 months of cultivating the plant, beyond that, after harvesting, we cut a singular slit down from the top of the tree all the way down the length, and then peel the bark away from the inner woody center. And then after that, once you have the bark, almost like a thick ribbon of bark, we peel the layers of bark away from each other until what's remaining is only the fibrous white colored bast. And depending on which process you are carrying out, that piece gets soaked and fermented for sometimes a month at a time, depending on temperature, size of the piece, thickness. And then that goes through several stages of beating and fermenting and repeated soaking to achieve a textile that's like this on the right side. Thin, almost like a cross between paper and cloth. And so you can imagine how soft it was because we used it for clothing, and even our newborn babies were caught in this material and wrapped to keep them warm. So if it was soft enough for a baby's skin, you can imagine how refined that tree bark had to be to achieve that kind of texture and pliability. On the left here is an image of one of my tools. This is a tool that I carved from wood that my Uncle Wes gathered on the Big Island where I'm from. It's ohio wood, and that pattern that you see is a watermark. It helps to imprint a final watermark into the fibers of the cloth so that when you hold it up to the light, you can actually see beautiful patterns that you may not be able to see otherwise. And this is a hallmark of traditional Native Hawaiian kapa. This is not something that you'll find anywhere else in the Pacific. So this is very particular and specific to Hawaiian kapa. And so all the old samples that you'll see in museums, they will probably have this kind of watermark. And they come in different shapes and forms, different patterns, and they, of course, have their own significance and symbolism as well, but maybe I'll get into that later. And so there's just kind of a close-up of the process. This is when I was at the School for Advanced Research doing a residency there in New Mexico. And you can kind of see how I'm putting a patch to create more regularity in the fibers. I think this piece ended up being 6 or 7 trees felted together. So if we were making something like a bed sheet, we could felt multiple trees together to create something that was large enough and wide enough to cover, to use as bedding. I think, the tree roughly as big around as this microphone here when we harvest it, to give you some ideas of context. And then it expands to, well, when you take it off the tree, it's about 4 inches across. Soaking it for the first time or beating it fresh, it expands to maybe about 1.5 to 2 feet. And soaking it even further, it can expand to maybe 3 feet or more. So you can imagine how thin it needs to be and how strong my arms are nowadays because of it. And so I think it's important also to understand where this work is coming from, and acknowledge that this practice has a history that spans over thousands of years. So what you see in museums today that's survived. And, in fact, Hawaiian kapa is actually very hard to find in, relative to samples of barkcloth from, say, Fiji or Tonga or Samoa, which have larger concentrations of unbroken traditions of this practice within family lines. For example, in my family, it hasn't been done, to my knowledge, in at least 7 or 8 generations. Whereas there's families in Samoa who have been doing it unbroken for very, very, very long. And so understanding that this practice comes from a rich heritage and lineage of practitioners and makers, I also think it's important that we as contemporary Native Hawaiians are not only working to reclaim this history and these ways of making and relating to our natural environment, but also bringing it into a contemporary way of making while using our traditional practices as a foundation. So I think it's important to do both. I think so much of our history and still what continues today is this perception that Native Hawaiians and indigenous people as a whole need to fit into a certain box of what our art should look like, or how we should dress, how we should talk, how we should move about in the world. And even I notice museums tend to continue those things, and there's a lot of institutions that are realizing how unfortunately problematic that is. And I think that's something that I really loved about being a part of this show at this museum was I don't think there were any pieces in that little group that fit the stereotypical mold or perception of what natives should be. And honestly, I don't even know what that is anymore. So maybe that's a good thing. So this is an older sample of the barkcloth. And these are traditional tools that I use, and I've carved all of these myself. And so in the slides that follow, you'll see a mix of hand-painted patterns like the ones in the show if you've gotten a chance to see, but also patterns that I create using these tools. And these are carved bamboo strips that are used to individually handprint about 6-inch sections of pattern at a time. And so on some of these larger pieces that you'll see in a moment, you can imagine how many times those patterns were inked up, painted, and imprinted on the material itself, sometimes thousands of times. I think we're gonna get to questions at the end, if that's all right. If you wanna just put a mental sticky note. But I'll remember you, I'll come to you. And so these are all traditional tools. You'll also find similar tools in museums as well. But going back to the idea that what is traditional can also be very contemporary and blurring the line between the two, you wouldn't find anything like this in traditional museum archives from late 1700s, early 1800s, mid 1800s, and beyond. This rainbow is kind of not something that you typically see. It is all earth pigments and plant dyes that I gathered myself, most of which are from Oregon. Actually, I think these are all from Oregon. When I was still living in Portland, even the blue. And so I think for me, because this practice is so inherently tied to the land, I don't feel comfortable using things like acrylic paints or synthetic materials, oils that have a lot of chemicals. And so all my pieces theoretically could be buried in the ground right where they came from. They're tree bark, right? So they could theoretically just be buried and have no adverse effect on the environment. Everything would just become dirt again. And this is another piece, again, kind of blurring the line between traditional and contemporary, because the design elements are more reminiscent of the overall composition that you might see in older samples, especially with samples that reference lightning bolts and things like that. Same with the color palette and the motifs, but you wouldn't typically find it as clean and as almost graphic as this. The black is wildfire charcoal from the Riverside Fire in 2020, and the red is red ochre from the Oregon coast. So I think it's also really fun and responsible to use pigments that I have a connection with, and I personally know the story of. You know, it's one thing to go to a store and buy paints, and that's one way to do it. I think for me, it really resonates with my work and with me on a personal level to represent these stories in places that I've had as an Indigenous person in transit. For most of my life, I've been separated from my ancestral homelands as part of the Native Hawaiian diaspora today, like so many of us. In fact, I think there's more Native Hawaiians that are living away from Hawaii today than there are who are actually living on our ancestral homelands. And that speaks to a lot of issues that are related to rising housing costs. I mean, I think for the first time a couple years ago, the median home price in Hawaii rose to over $1 million. That's the median home price. And that, coupled with limited job opportunities for a lot of those of us who are Native Hawaiian or mixed ancestry, limited options being tourism industry, service industry, or in the medical field. Low-grade nursing jobs typically is what you most would typically find. So being in the diaspora, my community has played a large part in holding me and supporting me as I've continued this work and continued learning and begun my career as a young Native artist. And these are a couple newer pieces that reference more traditional designs as well, traditional palette. And so if you remember those stamps that I showed you a few slides back, those bamboo tools, all of these patterns were created using those. So each individual imprint is about 6 inches long, give or take. So it took me a while to learn how to align them properly and tessellate them properly and use mask like paper to block out to create these like lozenge diamond shapes. And that's something that you'll see on samples of old kapa in museums as well. But again, this takes on a bit more of a contemporary feel, just in the layout, the composition, and the graphic quality of how clean the stamping is. And again, all these patterns represent different elements of our natural world, like rocks, lightning bolts, feathers, ferns, flowing water, birds. And so they're beautiful patterns, but they also have so much deeper meaning than that. And a lot of the protocol around that is pretty intense. It's good to acknowledge where the patterns come from or create new ones that speak to a contemporary experience, either for your family, your community, or individuals. And I think that also ties back into this idea of blending traditional and contemporary and kind of underlining the idea that those labels aren't necessarily helpful for us. You know, I think they further seek to divide when in actuality, like, everything that is traditional was once new too. So I think context of time is a huge part of that, and where do we draw the lines, and do we even really need to draw lines at all? So here's a close-up. And if you look in some areas where there's shadow, especially on the top left of the top left image, or the left image, you can see the watermark that I've used, and that's a fishnet watermark you'll see like a lattice with dots in each square. So that's one of our traditional watermarks beaten into the fibers of the kapa towards the very end of the process. And this pattern became ubiquitous throughout Hawaiian kapa on all islands that it was made, but it started off in fishing villages in Kauai, which is where I also have family lineage. And so this was another piece that I did at the School for Advanced Research a couple years ago in New Mexico. The red ochre is traditional, of course, but the layout of the piece, the composition, again, very contemporary. And this one speaks to kind of the embodiments, the various earthly forms of our deity Haumea, who kind of presides over fertility and creation, childbirth, things of that nature. And I think it's also really fun to incorporate kapa making into new ways of being and incorporating it into our daily lives as modern Hawaiians. This was a project that I did with the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBTQ advocacy group in the US. And they reached out to me as a queer Native Hawaiian artist to create this kapa piece for them, which eventually became a shirt. And again, like, you won't see rainbows on 17th century kapa. You won't see swirly forms like this. You definitely won't see a t-shirt in a museum collection of kapa. But again, like, speaking to the relevance for our community, what's accessible for our community, the prices that work is sometimes available for on the fine art market are not always accessible to those of us living back home. So what is? And this eventually kind of came out of that conversation and ended up being, I think, their most popular shirt ever. So, and again, like, bringing the new to a foundation rooted in past traditions. These kinds of gradients, they're all hand painted. There's nothing printed, things like that. It's all hand filled and painted. So all the gradients, all the colors, they're very old materials. I mean, charcoal and dirt, they're the same things that you might see in cave paintings in Lascaux. But they're still very relevant to a contemporary practice that you see in a museum. Same with things like this. Triangles and diamonds, patterns that have been used to represent many, many different things across cultures since time immemorial. And these are all natural pigments. The pinks are from Umatilla, for example. The red at the very bottom on the left, or I guess both of them, the reds are from the Maui coast. The blue is from the Oregon coast. So again, like, I don't have any pigments from places that I haven't gone to myself or haven't built a relationship with the people whose land those pigments come from. So again, that speaks to my diasporic movement as a contemporary Native Hawaiian. But also the history of our people is so vast and complex and intricate that we have stories of our people going all the way over to Mexico, to Chile, to Peru, and then on the other side of that, up into Alaska and Haida, and their people have the same stories. So I don't think we're making it up. But, you know, it's just really amazing to be able to be a part of that continuity and telling those continued stories through traditional barkcloth. Same with this one here. This is a variation, like a redo of the first piece that I showed you with the rainbow gradient. This piece will actually be on display in September through December at the 516 Gallery in Albuquerque. So if you are in the Southwest, take a look. It's going to be an amazing exhibition full of, I think, maybe 5 to 7 artists, all exploring different themes of gender fluidity. And so this piece, again, if you remember those bamboo stamping tools, that's what was used to create all the patterns on this piece. It's roughly 7 feet tall, installed, by 10, 11 feet wide. It always changes every time I install it. But this piece, I really wanted to talk about the importance of the integration between, or the integration of Western science and technology with traditional ecological knowledge held by Indigenous communities to address ongoing ecological decline and degradation all over the world. Particularly in Hawaii, where we are so isolated from everything else, we feel the effects of our changing climate, our changing environmental state a lot sooner than perhaps other places that are a little bit more cushioned. For example, we feel the growing intensity of our storms because our islands are literally eroding away as we speak. And we're also considered the endangered capital of the world, endangered species capital of the world. There have been more endangered species that have gone extinct in my lifetime than I can even count. And I'm not even that old. Although someone yesterday, we were with a bunch of kids for an event, and this one of our girls was saying like, oh yeah, this piece of art was, it's pretty old. It was given to, our director, but it's pretty old. It's from the 90s. So I'm from the 90s, so I guess I'm pretty old too. But, I think having these conversations about blending different ecological approaches together is very needed right now. And that's something that, as a barkcloth maker, that's inherent in the conversation of what I do all the time, because I'm literally working with dirt, trees, tree sap, bark. Everything that I do relies on things outside of myself that I cannot commercially acquire. I can't just go down to Blick and buy my tools. I can't just go on eBay and, get the materials that I need. And so this piece kind of speaks to the need for a shift, a change, a positive one. And so this piece is actually now in the collection of the National Gallery of Victoria in Australia. And it's part of their big international triennial exhibition that opens in December. And there's a close-up. And it was made from hand-stitched panels of mulberry papers, all stamped with those traditional tools, earth pigments, ochres, and then I made little ceramic beads to stitch in, and they each have my thumbprint in them. And so this is another piece. This was actually in progress, so you can kind of see the layout. I'm not sure if I put a finished image of this piece, which kind of defeats the purpose, but you can kind of see the blend of traditional and contemporary there. And this was actually the piece that I was working on when you saw the close-up of my hands earlier in the presentation. This is what that piece became. And almost everything that you see that is white eventually got filled in with red ochre. And so this was a piece that actually just came down from the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, where it was 118 degrees, so you guys are lucky here. This was an exhibition that we worked on to tell the story of Native Hawaiian surfing from a Native Hawaiian perspective, which hadn't really been done in this way before. And so it was a huge success, I can say. And not only did we have traditional practitioners like myself, like also another artist who was there representing traditional Lehuauakea weaving, traditional leaf weaving, where he made this giant sail out of leaves. We also had multimedia artists, projections, hand-cut paper like my partner does, and photography and things like that. So it was really amazing to see the blend of all of these different mediums and perspectives come together to tell the history and spiritual and cultural significance of a practice like surfing, which has its roots in Hawaii. So these were large barkcloth pieces that I suspended from the ceiling, and they're all about 14 feet long. Again, stamped with those traditional stamping tools, and all the dyes are plant dyes as well. And kind of as a departure from that, I've been asked to do a lot of strange and obscure and different art projects throughout my last few years of being a full-time artist. And one of those was to work on an installation for Facebook, which is now like Meta, out in Bellevue, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And so it was the largest piece that I've ever done. It's okay, I'm not mad. It was the largest piece that I've ever had the opportunity to do. It was 32 feet long, I think. And so I hand-painted patterns across the entire surface of the wall first, and then created these hand-stitched Tyvek panels that were all stamped with my traditional stamping tools. And this one, the patterns in particular, told the story of the water on its journey from the mountains to the sea. Because the whole Puget Sound region is so rich with natural life and water, salt water and fresh water. And it's so important that we work to preserve that. I think places like Seattle and that general region, we can always do better, but I think they're a great example of what good can happen when we work to preserve things like orca migration patterns, things like our forests and the natural waterways that run through them. And so that's kind of the idea behind this piece, but I also wanted it to be colorful and fun in ways that I don't typically get to do in the same ways with earth pigments and plant dyes that are sometimes fugitive or just have more of an earthy tone, understandably. And so kind of doing a whole 180 from that. Over the past couple years, I've been doing research for recreating our traditional Native Hawaiian barkcloth kites. And this is something that hasn't been successfully done on a large scale. Some of my teachers have made 1 or 2 kites in their lifetime, or in recent years as the practice has gotten more visibility, but still to this day we have no knowledge of any samples of these Native Hawaiian kites that have survived colonization. And perhaps understandably so, because they're so fragile, they're so light, they're so delicate. And so what I was doing is research, not only through online archives, but also in person at the Burke Museum in Seattle and the Bishop Museum in Hawaii as well, to look at kites from our Pacific cousins, so kites from like Fiji, Tahiti, Vanuatu, because they're all related. The kite followed us throughout our migration, like the barkcloth, like the paper mulberry tree, like so many other things. And as it took different forms, the root of that practice, the construction methods, certain shapes and materials were still in use when they made their way to Hawaii. And so that's kind of what I was digging into and really examining the measurements, looking at how things were lashed together, how heavy were things, what were the shapes and what did they use for certain parts of the frame and things like that. So through a big process of trial and error, I ended up being able to recreate 8 kites in total, 2 with the help of my partner who constructed the frame, and they're not on here, but because I added them later, but he constructed the frame and I put the kapa on it. And so the kites that I made all were our traditional shapes using only natural materials that my partner and I gathered, and one of our elder practitioners, like elder in mentality, I guess, sometimes, on Maui, and we gathered all the traditional materials that we would need to make this these kites, and all the pigments as well. They're all natural, and so it was very much a process of trial and error, a lot of failure throughout, but you learn from your failings, and I think that was one of my favorite parts of this process, using the kapa that I make to create a utilitarian object, not just something that sits on a wall, something that has a rich history of ceremony, of community practice and community-oriented belief, because these were very spiritual objects for our people. So this is just 2 of the ones that I was able to make, and we actually held an event yesterday in Portland at the Center for Native Arts and Cultures that's run by NACF out there. And we invited our whole community to come out, look at these kites, share food, share space, share the stories of our traditional mo'olelo or mythologies of these practices, and then eventually work together to create pieces of one of the tails for one of the kites. So it was like a nice community event where everyone had a part to play, and it was really awesome to see that and to be able to bring that to my community, many of which are Native Hawaiians who are displaced from back home. So being able to stay connected and bring that connection and visibility to our people up here on the continent is, I think, one of the most fulfilling parts of what I'm able to do. Oh, this is a couple more of the kites, by the way. All right, well, I think we'll open it up for questions in a minute, but I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for being here and for filling the room, and for your attention, and just visiting the museum and the space. If you haven't had a chance to check out the exhibition, please do. But yeah, thank you so much. So I think one person earlier had a question in the back, but we'll just open it up as well. Yes?
Well, I was wondering about your colors. They're so brilliant. The blue came from, what did you use for blue?
It's a rare earth pigment called Vivianite, and it's found on the Oregon coast.
And the yellow?
There's several different yellows. So I have yellows, one that I use from turmeric, which is a traditional dye plant and medicine that we would use. That's the only plant dye yellow that I have. Otherwise, I have yellow ochres from Maui, from the Oregon coast, and from a little bit inland as well, in Oregon.
Can you say a little bit more about the works that are on view upstairs? You have a wonderful artist statement that explains your thinking around that, where you gathered the materials, but for anyone who might not have read about that yet, can you share a little bit here?
Yeah. So I think it's 5 pieces. 5? Yeah. 5 pieces. And each of them are unique. There's no repeated same motifs or set of patterns in each one. And they're all different colors, you'll notice. And each of those pigments is specific to a certain area of Oregon. Of course, those are occupied by the traditional native homelands of tribes around this region. So that's what the title of each piece corresponds to the pigments that I used and where I gathered those pigments. And for me, they kind of conceptually speak to my being in transit. I kind of alluded to that earlier, just being part of the diaspora, part of being displaced from my own ancestral homelands, and building relationships with a lot of Indigenous people from Oregon because I've spent so much time here. I lived in Oregon for about 12 years after I was born here, and then moved back to Big Island. But anyway, yeah, I think they tell stories of not just my experience, but the relationships that I've had with these people in these places and the lands themselves. And I think it's also really important to never take without giving back, or like do something to help the land that you're gathering from, and never take too much, never take more than you actually need or will use. Even if it's just cleaning up trash at the site where you gather. Little things. So, yes.
Yeah, so that's the question I have is where do you harvest the fiber from? Like, do you have it in your backyard? Like, how, where do you get that from? And then once you've taken the fibers out, what do you do with like the remaining wood and the remaining bark? Like, is it discarded, or do you use that for tools, or?
Yeah, so several means of getting the fibers that I work with. Paper mulberry grows very, very well out in Hawaii. As you can imagine, it needs a temperate location environment. So when I'm back, I try to gather with my teachers as much as I can. Just spend time with them and also work and clean up the groves that they have out there, because they're getting older, and any help that they can get to maintain and clean the groves is very much needed and appreciated. So some of the material that I've worked with and that I have is from my teachers' groves. Some of it is from a grove out at Halau Kumana Charter School, which is out in Manoa. And then I also have been sent material from my teacher, one of my teachers, Auntie Delani Tanahi, also on Oahu. And then my Uncle Wes also has a connection out in Fiji, where they send me the rough material, and then I'm able to ferment it further and beat it, watermark it, etc. Because where I'm at currently in New Mexico, the material doesn't grow. I wonder why. So that is a certain limitation being on the continent right now. So in the next couple of years, my partner and I would like to move back home to the Big Island, start growing our own trees, and that way I'm able to take on my own apprentices and do workshops for schools, kids, things like that. Because this is working at museums and in galleries and doing commissions and things like that. That's wonderful, but I think it all feeds back into this larger goal of being back on my ancestral homelands, being able to be held by my community back home, and give back in that way. Yes.
Hi, aloha. You mentioned maybe there's a connection, the roots of the arts from Taiwan. There's 16 Aboriginal tribes there, and like this week and next week, the tribes from the Pacific Northwest are getting together with those 16 tribes from Taiwan and having a boat ride, canoe ride, up north. And I was wondering if you went back to Taiwan and checked out those tribes and see if they're still doing it.
I have not had the opportunity to go, but it is on the to-do list. I think maybe one of my teachers has had the opportunity to connect with at least a few practitioners back there, because I know they're still at least making paper. It's typically pulped in that region, like in China and Japan, they pulp it. I know in Indonesia, they beat, like how we do. They use a slightly different tool. But yeah, I haven't been able to connect with them yet, but hopefully one day. Yes.
I was really struck by how frequently you talked about kapa in the museum, particularly these older examples like 17th, 18th century. It's an unfortunate fact that a lot of this indigenous material culture was taken forcibly into the Americas. So I was curious from your experience, how have you seen that work, that older work, discussed in the museum context, and if you know of any repatriation efforts to get that material returned and get indigenous stewardship?
That's a great question. Thank you. As far as repatriation efforts go, they're more centered around the remains of our ancestors, so bones, things like that. I do know that, I think was it Te Papa in Aotearoa, that museum, they repatriated some artifacts from our people, including a feather cape, I believe.
From Kalaniʻōpuʻu.
Yeah, and so, but there are Pacific ancestors as well, so they understand that so much was taken from them, so much was taken from us too, so they can empathize on that level. But largely, no. A lot of it has gone into private collections and just changed hands for decades, sometimes even centuries. Occasionally you'll find stuff on eBay. And I literally just woke up at 5 in the morning a couple weeks ago to bid on a piece of kapa to rescue it from a life of auctions and bring it back home. And it was a very rare find. You typically don't find Hawaiian kapa up for sale. And when you do, it's typically a small piece. So this was a small piece that was cut from a larger piece so that they could continue distributing it, make little sample books, and show people wow, how amazing, we have all these samples that, they're 5 by 7 pieces that were cut from something that was maybe 10 feet wide. And so pieces of our culture are all around the world. Some of it is coming back home, and some of it's unfortunately not. A lot of it was taken out of burials, out of grave sites, which is unfortunately a really common thing that you find with indigenous cultures across the globe. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work that museums have to do. But I think, just me on my eBay, I try to help out with that. Did you have another question in the corner?
Just wanted to mention that the Burke Museum has, I think it's probably been 10 years or more now, has had this ongoing practice of returning objects. And so in the museum, you'll see a picture or just a blank place where they say it was repatriated. One of the most amazing collections of Native sacred objects from my husband's people is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Gilcrease Museum has drawers and drawers of sacred objects, and his people have asked for them back. Not yet gotten them back, but I do appreciate the Burke Museum for at least giving back the things that they just return them to.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. Because I have worked with the Burke Museum on and off in the past, they have been very helpful and very accommodating. And yeah, you're right. They do occasionally give things back when they can and when they can trace it. In fact, Holly, I'm forgetting her name, her last name, but Holly at the Burke Museum gave me a large piece of Tongan Ngatu barkcloth that was donated to the museum that they just, for some reason, couldn't take into their collections. And instead of stashing it away in another drawer, because they already have hundreds of pieces, she gave it to me because I knew the significance of that pattern and explained it to a class. And she ended up just saying, well, in that case, you should have it. So yeah, they're awesome there. They were very helpful throughout a lot of my kite research and other research that I've done. In fact, they're one of the only museums that I know of, or a large museum, where they actually allow you to visit their collections, and if you're part of that community which the object or artifact comes from, you're allowed to touch it without gloves, which is not common at all. So you're able to literally connect with your ancestors in that way, and I think that's really beautiful.
In Seattle.
Yeah, it's in Seattle. It's part of UW. Any other questions?
I'm seeing a piece of barkcloth that is kind of orange in color, and the painting on it, or the pattern on it is a deeper, like brown, but it's very shiny. So do you know why it would have that shiny appearance?
Not entirely without actually seeing where it comes from, because the plant dyes and pigments that were used were so place specific. It sounds like it's probably gonna be from Samoa or Tonga.
It's really an orange color.
Yeah, it's probably melted down resin from the tree that they used for the dye. But again, I cannot say for a fact without seeing
But
the.
that makes sense, that's
Yeah.
why it would be shiny, because I've always wondered why that was so shiny. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for your beautiful talk and for sharing about your work. Very moving. You talked a number of times about the connection of your work to traditional ecological knowledge, and then a couple times you hinted at its relationship to stories, traditional stories, oral tradition. And I wonder if there are more connections with stories or with other performative art forms, and how those art forms traditionally or in the contemporary context interface.
Yeah, so in Hawaiian language and culture, we have this word called kauna. Kauna means roughly the layers of meaning behind a certain pattern, symbol, or even a word, or a song, chant. So you might see the surface layer, the literal meaning, but it has 7 or more rough translations of what that could mean or what it could symbolize. For example, the sweet smell of a flower, that could also refer to a lover's embrace. That's something that you often see in songs, more contemporary songs, but still, just as an example. So carrying that idea over to our traditional oral histories and mythologies, you might have a story that on the surface tells a very literal thing, but deeper down there's many, many layers to understanding the deeper meanings and significance and implications of that story. And so a lot of that knowledge is applied to our histories that talk about relationships with the land, with the ocean, and we have, of course, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands. But those relationships are still applicable today. Even though they were stories that have been told for 500, 600, 1,000, 2,000 years, those are still very relevant into how we move in contemporary times, how we deal with issues like climate change and overheating oceans and coral die-off and our species dying off as well. So a lot of the pieces that I've made in the past and will continue to make bring in aspects of those mythologies and oral histories because they're so relevant today, no matter how old they are. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
You had mentioned that the patterns that are used in your works can be as granular as being significant to the families. I'm curious if you have discovered or if you've have done any research into patterns that may be significant to your family or your lineage and trying to incorporate that into your work.
So from the kapa making side, because it hasn't been done in my family for so long. It wasn't passed down to me from my parents or my grandparents or even my great-grandparents. Currently, it might change, but currently I don't have the knowledge of any patterns that were specific to my family for kapa making. With our traditional tattooing, that's a little different because I did the work in my genealogy and went far back enough to have one of our cultural practitioners who does traditional uhi or tattoo work, the hand tap method, and that those patterns are imparted into my skin to wear every day. But they represent my family's line, our kuleana to the community, and also my personal journey as well. So kind of all wrapped up into a set of patterns. That's a little different than kapa making, related but different. So I don't use those patterns specifically in my kapa making. But then I'll also say that because I envision barkcloth making and this practice carrying on for more than just my lifetime, ideally for many, many, many generations after myself, I want to continue building on pattern making for my family line. So this pattern that you'll see here is a variation of the sea urchin pattern that I created specifically for my family. I use it as my signature, but presumably my kids and their kids will be able to use this as a family signature as well, almost like a crest. And so things like that. And I've created a few different patterns that are specifically just for my family, which comes with a whole layer of extra protocol and things like that. But yeah, I think, it's better to start somewhere, even if there's limited access to knowledge and pattern making that still exists, or, so building a tradition and continuing that tradition on. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for coming and visiting with us and sharing your presentation, and for contributing work to the exhibition too. It's been wonderful.
It's been awesome to be here, and also I'm super glad that it was extended. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.